The rope was coarse against her skin, a familiar and indifferent pain. It had rubbed the flesh over her wrists raw long ago, and now the dust of the street worked its way into the open sores, a fine grit that felt like ground glass. She did not flinch. She had learned the futility of it. She stood tied to the hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square, a boil of dust and sun-baked earth. The sun was a hammer beating down on her uncovered head, turning the world to a shimmering haze of white and brown. Her feet, bare and cracked, were planted in the dirt, the only solid things in a world that had dissolved into shame. Men leaned against the shadowed fronts of the general store and the saloon, their hats tipped low. Their eyes slid over her, assessing, judging, or dismissing her entirely. She was a piece of unfortunate scenery, a stray dog, a broken wagon wheel. Some muttered to each other, a low rumble like distant thunder, their words lost to the dry wind that whispered past her ears. The man who had tied her there, the man whose name tasted like ash in her memory, stood a few paces away. His voice was loud, practiced, the voice of a man selling worn-out mules. He gestured toward her, a grand sweep of his arm. He spoke of her strength, her obedience. He did not speak of her as a person. She was an asset to be liquidated. She kept her eyes fixed on a loose board on the porch of the assayer's office across the way. She counted the knots in the wood. 1, 2, 3. A dark, swirling eye. Another like a stretched-out star. If she focused on the board, she did not have to see the faces. She did not have to feel the weight of their stares, heavy as stones. The crowd thinned. Interest, like a shallow puddle in the heat, evaporated. They had their own lives, their own miseries. A woman tied to a post was a brief distraction, nothing more. Her husband's voice grew strained, a thread of desperation weaving through the bravado. The price dropped, then dropped again. Soon he was just asking for the cost of a bottle. Silence fell. It was a different kind of silence than the one she carried inside herself. This one was public, heavy with failure. Her husband spat in the dust. He looked at her then, his eyes small and mean, and for a moment she felt a flicker of fear. The fear of what he would do when this last humiliation was over. It was then that a shadow detached itself from the deeper shade of the livery stable. A man walked into the unforgiving light of the square. He moved with a slowness that was not laziness but a kind of deliberate weight, as if the ground itself required his full attention. He wore a worn duster the color of the road, and his boots kicked up little ghosts of dust with each step. He was not a big man, but there was a stillness to him, a core of quiet that seemed to suck the noise from the air around him. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, and something deeper, something that lived behind his eyes. He looked tired, but it was a weariness that had settled into his bones long ago. He stopped a few feet from her husband, his gaze not on the blustering man, but on her. It was not the assessing look of the others. It was long and steady and held no judgment she could name. It simply saw. It saw the rope, the raw skin, the bare feet. It saw the way she held her shoulders, a fragile defense against a world of fists. Section, her husband, seeing a potential customer, puffed up his chest again. See something you like, friend? Sturdy. Quiet. Good for work. The stranger's eyes did not leave hers. He seemed to be asking a question without words. She had no answer to give. She looked back at the knot in the wooden board. Then the quiet man spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones shifting at the bottom of a dry creek bed. I have a debt with you, Silas. Silas squinted, confused. Debt? From the spring, the man said. The seed barley. Understanding dawned on Silas's face, followed by suspicion. What of it? I'll call it paid, the man said. He finally looked at Silas, and his gaze was flat, unreadable. For her. A silence stretched, taut and thin. Silas looked from the stranger to the woman and back again. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. He saw a fool. He saw an easy bargain. He saw a way out of his own mess. Done, Silas spat, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He didn't spare her another glance. He turned and walked toward the saloon, his shoulders already lighter. The stranger stood there for a long moment as the dust settled. The remaining onlookers began to drift away, their small bit of theater concluded. He watched Silas disappear through the swinging doors, and a muscle worked in his jaw. Only then did he move toward her. He did not speak. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn pocketknife. The click of the blade opening was the loudest sound in the square. He moved behind her, and she flinched, a small, involuntary jerk of her shoulders, bracing for a blow that did not come. His hands were careful. He worked the knife under the thick rope at her wrists, sawing through the fibers. He was methodical, his knuckles brushing against her skin without pressure, without lingering. The scent of dust and leather and something like clean earth came from him. The first rope fell away. Then the second. Her hands dropped to her sides, numb and tingling. Blood began to well in the chafed rings around her wrists. She cradled one hand in the other, her gaze on the dark red beads. He stepped back, giving her space. He folded his knife and slid it back into his coat. He waited. She did not know what to do. Freedom was a country she no longer recognized. She stood rooted to the spot, the ghost of the rope still clinging to her. He gestured with his head toward a dun-colored horse tied in the shade. Come on, it was not a command but a statement of fact. She took a hesitant step, then another. The ground was hot and sharp beneath her bare feet. She followed him, a small, ragged shadow trailing a taller, quieter one. He untied his horse, mounted in a single, fluid motion, and then looked down at her. He offered no hand to help her up. He simply waited for her to find her own way. She placed a foot in the stirrup he'd left empty and pulled herself up behind him, settling on the horse's rump, her hands hovering uncertainly in the air before she finally rested them on the back of the saddle, careful not to touch him. The journey was a long, silent procession. The horse's hooves made a steady, rhythmic thud against the packed earth, a sound that became the world's only heartbeat. The sun slid down the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. The wind picked up, a cool breath against her hot skin. He rode without looking back, his posture unchanging. He seemed a part of the landscape, as weathered and enduring as the rock formations that rose from the plains. After an hour, he reined in the horse. Without a word, he unhooked a canteen from his saddle and passed it back to her. Her hands trembled as she took it. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it was the first kindness she had known in so long it felt like a sacrament. She drank slowly, carefully, then passed it back. His fingers brushed hers as he took it, a brief, impersonal contact that still sent a jolt through her. He nudged the horse forward again into the growing twilight. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the creak of leather, the sigh of the wind through the sagebrush, and the vast, unspoken space of their shared journey. It was a liminal space, a pause between the life that was over and the one that had not yet begun. They arrived as the first stars were pricking the deep indigo of the sky. The house was a dark shape against the horizon, a low-slung cabin built of rough-hewn logs. It looked small and solitary, as if it had been dropped into the middle of nowhere and forgotten. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a sign of a fire banked low. The man dismounted and stood for a moment, just looking at the house. It seemed to her that the cabin was an extension of him, stoic, unadorned, and holding its secrets close. There was a hard-worn functionality to it, but no softness, no welcome. To one side, under a lone, twisted cottonwood, was a small, fenced-off rectangle of earth. A single wooden cross, stark and pale in the moonlight, stood at its head. He led the horse to a trough by a small barn, letting it drink. She slid down, her legs stiff and clumsy. She stood by the side of the house, wrapping her arms around herself, suddenly cold. The land itself felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. He finished with the horse and came toward her. He didn't stop, just pushed open the heavy wooden door and went inside. A moment later, the warm glow of a lamp spilled out onto the porch. He reappeared in the doorway. Food's on the table. She hesitated. The threshold felt like a barrier, a line she was not sure she should cross. He seemed to understand. He stepped back from the door, leaving the way clear. He walked over to the fireplace and busied himself with the embers, turning his back to her. It was a deliberate act, an offering of privacy. She took a deep breath that tasted of dust and cold night air and stepped inside. The interior was one large room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center. In one corner was a bed, neatly made. On the table, as he'd said, was a plate with a chunk of bread and some cold meat next to a tin cup of water. It was a spare, masculine space, clean but lived in. Everything had its place. He gestured with his chin toward a closed door in the far wall. That's your room. He turned back to the fire. Door doesn't have a lock on it. Never has. The words hung in the air. I don't lock doors. It was an assurance. A promise of a different kind of life than the one she had known. She walked to the table and picked up the bread. Her stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was painful. She ate standing up quickly like a stray animal ready to bolt. He didn't watch her. He stoked the fire, the soft scrape of the poker against stone the only sound. When she was finished, she went to the door he had indicated and opened it. The room was small, little more than a closet, but it was clean. A narrow cot with a thin mattress and a single folded blanket sat against the wall. A small, high window looked out onto the darkness. It was a space, and it was hers. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, leaving it slightly ajar. She sat on the edge of the cot, the thin blanket clutched in her hands. She could hear the crackle of the fire from the other room, the sound of a man moving about his life. For the first time in more than a year, she was in a room, behind a door, and no one was going to force it open. She did not cry. The well of her tears had run dry long ago. Instead, a great, shuddering wave of exhaustion washed over her, so profound it was almost peaceful. She lay down on the cot, fully clothed, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The days settled into a rhythm, slow and quiet as a turning season. He rose before the sun, and the smell of coffee and wood smoke would drift under her door. By the time she emerged from her small room, he would be gone, already out mending a fence or tending to the 2 cows and handful of chickens that constituted his livestock. He would leave a piece of bread or a bowl of oatmeal on the table for her. She began to work. There were no orders given, no expectations stated. She simply saw what needed doing and did it. She swept the dust that perpetually tried to reclaim the cabin floor. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the hearth. She took his worn work shirts from a pile in the corner and mended the rips with neat, tiny stitches, her fingers remembering a skill from a life before. He would return at midday, his face grimed with sweat and dirt. They would eat in silence at the table, sitting across from each other. The space between them was vast, an open plain of unspoken things. He ate with a focused intensity, as if it were just another chore to be completed. She ate slowly, making the food last. One afternoon, she found a bucket with a broken handle by the well. She struggled with it, trying to carry it lopsided. The next morning, the handle was fixed, the wood smooth and reinforced with a strip of new leather. He never mentioned it. Another day, while weeding the small, struggling vegetable patch near the house, she found a single, stubborn wildflower pushing its way through the hard-packed earth. A splash of defiant blue against the endless brown. On impulse, she picked it. She carried it over to the small, fenced-in grave under the cottonwood tree and laid it gently on the mound of earth. When he came in from the fields that evening, he stopped on the porch and looked toward the grave for a long time. His shoulders seemed to slump just for a moment, as if carrying a weight she could only guess at. When he came inside, his eyes were shadowed, but he said nothing. He simply placed a slightly thicker, warmer shawl on the foot of her cot that night while she was fetching water. They worked in parallel orbits, 2 solitary planets circling the same small sun of the cabin. She learned the landscape of his silence. There was the weary silence of the day's end. The taut silence that meant a fence was down and a cow was missing. The deep, hollow silence when his gaze would linger on the grave of the woman who must have been his wife and the child who must have been his. He carried whole winters in his eyes. She, in turn, began to fill the quiet spaces with small sounds. The soft whisk of the broom. The rhythmic chop of vegetables for the evening stew. One afternoon, while kneading bread, a tune surfaced from some deep, forgotten part of her. She began to hum it, a low, melancholy air. He was sitting on the porch, mending a piece of harness, and he went very still. He did not turn, but he stopped working, his hands frozen in midair, until her humming faded back into silence. That night, the bread was heavy, a dense, failed loaf. He broke off a piece and chewed it thoughtfully. That loaf died in vain, he said, his voice dry. It was the first time he had made anything close to a joke. A small, startled sound escaped her throat, almost a laugh. It's a little dry, she admitted, her own voice thin from disuse, like a fence rail. You didn't complain about mine, he countered, a ghost of a smile touching the corner of his mouth before vanishing. The moment was brief, fragile as a soap bubble, but it left a shimmer in the air between them. One night, a storm rolled in, a black tide of clouds that swallowed the moon. Wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a low, mournful sound. Rain lashed against the single window in the main room. She lay on her cot, listening, the sound of the wind dredging up old fears. A crack of thunder, sharp and violent, shook the very logs of the house. She sat bolt upright, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The darkness in her small room felt suffocating, pressing in on her. She could feel the phantom weight of a locked door, the terror of a confined space. Her breathing grew shallow, ragged. She stumbled out of her room into the main cabin. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands. He was already awake, sitting up in his bed, a silhouette against the faint orange glow. You hurt? He asked, his voice low and steady. She shook her head, unable to speak. She wrapped her arms around herself, trembling. He didn't move from his bed. He didn't come toward her. He simply watched her, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of her fear. The wind's got a mean streak tonight, he said, as if commenting on the weather were the most normal thing in the world. She managed a small, choked sound of agreement. It'll pass, he said. It always does. He didn't tell her to go back to her room. He didn't question her fear. He just stayed awake with her. He threw another log on the fire, and the flames leaped up, pushing back the shadows. She sank onto the floor by the hearth, drawing her knees to her chest. He remained in his bed across the room. They sat that way for hours, two silent guardians in a small circle of light while the storm raged outside. He did not sleep until he heard the rhythm of her breathing even out, until he knew she had found her own small peace. In the morning, the world was washed clean. The air smelled of rain and wet earth. The silence between them felt different. Softer. A thread of understanding had been woven in the dark. As she was clearing the breakfast plates, she paused. The question had been sitting on her tongue for weeks, a smooth, heavy stone. She turned to him where he stood by the door pulling on his boots. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you take me?" He finished pulling on his boot and stood up slowly. He looked at her, his gaze direct. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He thought for a long moment, as if searching for the truest words. "My wife, Sarah," he began, and the name hung in the air, a presence of its own. She was a kind woman. She wouldn't have let that stand. She would have stepped forward. He looked away, out the open door toward the vast, empty land. "I guess," he said, his voice rough with an old grief, "I'm still trying to be the man she thought I was." He put on his hat and walked out into the bright morning, leaving her with the weight of his honesty. It was an answer that asked nothing of her, but gave her everything. It gave her context. It gave her the story of the grave under the tree. And it gave her the knowledge that his kindness wasn't about her, not really. It was about him. It was about a promise he had made to a memory. And that somehow made it feel safer. More real. Life settled back into its quiet routine, but the foundation had shifted. The trust between them, once a fragile seedling, began to put down tentative roots. They were stitching their lives together with raw thread, creating a tapestry of shared work and silent companionship. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, a dark speck growing steadily larger against the pale sky. He was not coming from the direction of the town. He was coming from the east, from the desolate plains where few people lived. Elias, who had been splitting wood, stopped his work, the axe held loosely in his hand. He watched the riders approach, his body still, his face unreadable. She was on the porch, shelling beans into a clay bowl. The rhythmic click-clack of the beans falling stopped. She felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Strangers were rare. Strangers were trouble. The rider drew closer, and she could see he was a boy, no more than 16, on a lathered horse. He rode with a desperate urgency. He pulled his horse to a skidding halt in front of the cabin, his eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. "Mr. Thorne," the boy gasped, looking at Elias. Elias nodded slowly, his eyes narrowed. "I'm Thorne." "It's Silas," the boy said, breathing hard. "He's coming. He's got two others with him. They've been drinking heavy at Miller's Crossing. He says he's coming to get what's his." The boy looked from Elias to her, and his face filled with a kind of pitying dread. "He says he's coming to get his wife." The bowl of beans slipped from her lap, scattering across the wooden porch with a sound like falling rain. Elias's expression did not change, but something in his stillness hardened, like iron cooling. He gave the boy a curt nod. "I'm obliged to you for the warning." "He ain't far behind," the boy said, already turning his horse. "Maybe an hour." "Be careful, mister." He spurred his horse and galloped away, disappearing back the way he came. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the hum of insects in the afternoon heat. The world seemed to shrink to the small patch of land around the cabin. She stood frozen on the porch, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The past she had so carefully buried was clawing its way back to the surface. The phantom rope tightened around her wrists. Elias walked to the porch and stood before her. He looked down at her, and his eyes, for the first time, held a fierce, protective light. "Go inside," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Stay there." She shook her head, a small, defiant motion. No, the word was thin, but it was there. It was hers. He looked surprised. He studied her face, saw the terror there, but also a flicker of something new. A spark of defiance in the ashes of her fear. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, a gesture of acceptance. He went into the cabin. He came back out with a long rifle, checking the action with practiced, economical movements. He leaned it against the wall by the door. He didn't look at her again. He walked to the edge of the porch and stood there, facing east, a solitary figure waiting for a war he did not ask for. She went inside. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely function. She looked around the small, quiet room that had become her sanctuary. The mended shirts, the clean floor, the sturdy chair by the fire. This was a life she had helped to build. She would not let it be torn down. Her eyes fell on the iron poker resting by the hearth. It was long and heavy. She picked it up. The cool, solid weight of it in her hand was a comfort. She went back out to the porch and stood a few feet behind Elias, the poker held tight in her grip. They waited. The sun beat down. The land itself was holding its breath. An hour passed, feeling like a lifetime. And then they appeared. 3 riders, dark shapes shimmering in the heat haze. They approached slowly with a swaggering confidence. In the lead was Silas, his face flushed with drink and self-righteous anger. He reined his horse in just beyond the meager fence that marked the edge of the yard. His 2 companions fanned out on either side of him, their hands resting near their hips. "Thorn," Silas bellowed, his voice thick and ugly. "I've come for my property." His eyes slid past Elias to fix on her. A possessive, triumphant sneer twisted his lips. "Get yourself out here, woman. You've had your little holiday." Elias did not move. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his body relaxed but ready. He looked like a mountain that had no intention of being moved. "She's not your property, Silas," he said, his voice calm and carrying easily in the still air. "And this is my land. You're not welcome here. Turn around and ride away." Silas laughed. A harsh, grating sound. "Is that so? I have a paper. A marriage certificate. Says she belongs to me. The law is on my side." "There's law," Elias said, his voice dropping lower, colder. "And then there's what's right. You gave up any claim you had when you tied her to a post for public sale." "I was teaching her a lesson," Silas roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "And you interfered in my business." He started to dismount, his hand going to the pistol at his belt. It was then that she moved. She stepped out from behind Elias, moving to stand beside him. She raised the heavy iron poker, holding it like a weapon. Her knuckles were white, her body trembling, but her gaze was fixed on Silas, clear and unwavering. "No," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension with the sharpness of glass. It was the voice of a person, not an object. A person who had made a choice. Silas stopped, his foot halfway out of the stirrup. He stared at her, his mouth agape. He had expected a cowering, broken creature. He did not know this woman who stood before him, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen. He looked from her to the cold, unyielding face of Elias, to the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. Elias took one slow, deliberate step forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. He did not raise his hands. He did not shout. He simply stood as a barrier. "You heard her," he said softly. "This is her home now. You'll not touch her. You'll not set foot on this land again. If you do, I will take it as a threat to my life and my home. And I will defend them." The quiet certainty in his voice was more menacing than any shouted threat. It was a statement of absolute, unshakable fact. Silas hesitated. He looked at his companions, but they offered no support. Their drunken courage was rapidly evaporating in the face of the silent, unified front. They saw a man who meant what he said and a woman who was no longer a victim. This was not the easy fight they had imagined. This was something else entirely. This was a stand. With a curse, Silas yanked his foot back into the stirrup. He glared at them, his face a mask of impotent fury. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. He wheeled his horse around so violently it reared and galloped away, his companions scrambling to follow, their retreat a cloud of ignominious dust. They stood together on the porch, watching until the riders were nothing more than specks on the horizon. The silence they left behind was vast and profound. The world slowly began to breathe again. Her strength gave out all at once. The poker slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the wooden boards. Her legs buckled and she sank to her knees, a great, shuddering tremor running through her. Elias was there in an instant. He knelt in front of her, his hands hovering, not touching her but close enough to be a shield. "It's all right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "They're gone. You're safe." "I was scared," she whispered, the words torn from her throat. "I know," he said softly. "You were brave." He reached out then and gently, carefully took her hand. His fingers were calloused and warm around hers. He helped her to her feet and led her inside into the quiet safety of the house. That evening, the air in the cabin was different. The last of the old ghosts had been exorcised by the fire of their stand. The space between them was no longer an empty plain, but a shared territory earned and defended. They sat by the fire, the silence comfortable, companionable. He was cleaning his rifle, the methodical movements a calming ritual. She was stitching a patch onto his sleeve, her own hands steady now. He finished his task and set the rifle aside. He looked at her, truly looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time without the shadows of the past clinging to her. "I've never asked your name," he said quietly. She looked up from her sewing, a needle poised in midair. She had been a wife, a possession, a woman, a nameless creature he had rescued. The name she had been born with felt like a relic from another person's life. To say it out loud felt like an act of claiming, of planting a flag in the soil of her own soul. "It's Lena," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Lena," he repeated, testing the sound of it in the quiet room. It fit. It settled in the space between them, a solid, beautiful thing. "It's a good name," he paused, then added, "My name is Elias." It was a formal introduction, months too late and perfectly on time. An acknowledgement of two whole people, sitting together by a fire. The next morning, she took the ragged, filthy dress she had worn on the day she arrived, the last symbol of her old life, and she laid it in the hearth. Elias watched her, understanding without needing to be told. He lit a match and held it to the cloth. They watched together as it curled, blackened, and turned to ash. A fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. Weeks turned into months. A season turned. The harsh bite of autumn gave way to the deep, quiet cold of winter. Snow fell, blanketing the land in a pristine white silence. The cabin became their entire world, a small, warm arc against the cold. They moved around each other with an easy, practiced grace. A life had taken root. One evening, as Elias came in from feeding the animals, shaking snow from his coat, he found Lena standing by the window, looking out at the endless white. She had hung a small string of dried wildflowers over the window frame, a splash of summer's color against the winter gray. The house, which had once been so spare and haunted, now held touches of her everywhere. It breathed with a new life. It felt like a home. He came to stand beside her, following her gaze. The world was peaceful, asleep under its white blanket. "You didn't run," he said, his voice low. It wasn't a question. She turned to look at him. His eyes, which had once held so many winters, now held a different kind of light, a warmth that mirrored the fire in the hearth. "No," she said. "I didn't run," she smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "This is where I belong." He reached out and tucked a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle, hesitant, but full of an unspoken truth that resonated deeper than any words. It was a gesture of belonging, a gesture of love. They stood there for a long time, side by side, watching the snow fall, two solitary souls who had found a shared harbor in the heart of the storm. The house was quiet, warm, and for the first time in a very long time, it was full. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. It isn't just about a man saving a woman from a terrible fate. It's about the quiet courage it takes to build a life from the wreckage of another. It's about two broken people who, instead of trying to fix each other, simply made space for the other's wounds. They didn't have grand words or soaring promises. They had bread on the table, a mended shirt, a fire in the hearth on a cold night. They had the silent, steady language of care. Real strength, you see, is rarely loud. Sometimes it's just the will to get up one more time, to sweep a floor, to plant a flower on a grave, to stand your ground when the past comes knocking. It's the choice to be kind in a world that has been anything but. So here is your naming. Here is the reminder that a home is not four walls, but the safety you build in another's presence. It's the proof that even after the cruelest winter, if you are brave enough, if you are patient enough, something new can and will grow in the thaw.